Alright guys, happy Tuesday! So it seems that Gaijin is really getting prepared for the next patch. They're starting to do lots of devlogs. I would imagine we're probably going to see one every other day, probably like 5 or 6 previews on what is to come in patch 1.67. Yesterday we saw the RU-251, the Spähpanzer, and now we have the T-14, which is what you're looking at right now, which looks like a pretty up-armored Sherman tank. It's almost like a Sherman and a Panther did the dirty, and this was the baby. This was the beautiful little baby tank that popped out. And you know, I would guess that the Sherman would have been the female. So the Sherman was the mother, and the Panther was the father. Guys, this is historically accurate stuff, so deal with it. But anyway, it looks pretty cool. But the tank in itself, 2 prototypes were made. The cool thing about it was that it was made by both the British and the Americans working together. It ended up not going into production because the Brits had their Churchills, and then the Americans kind of developed the T-20 instead of this, and it just came late. Like, they decided, hey, in 1942, let's do this, and then 1944, this is what they came about, but it's like they already had better tank designs by the time it was 1944. But you'll see in the video, this thing is fighting a Panzer IV, so it makes you kind of wonder what BR it is. Anyway, guys, let's check it out. Let's see what Gaijin has to say. But yesterday, when we were covering the RU-251, someone made the comment. It was pretty funny. Danku Ninju said, Gaijin, we need more Zoo 57-2 food. Gaijin to themselves, say no more, fam. So everybody kind of knows that, you know, the zoos just wreck leopards, and now the Spähpanzer is likely to be fodder for the Zoo 57-2 as well. Dude, how about those changes to the Japanese high-tier tanks? What do you guys think about that? Anyway, let's get into it. So, in the run-up to the Second World War, there was a general consensus that heavy infantry support tanks would soon be needed on the battlefields. Several powers had already launched production and deployment of heavy tanks. Meanwhile, the British and American tank designers were just getting down to developing a specification for their concept. After a visit by the head of the U.S. Army Ordnance Department to the United Kingdom, engineers from both countries began working on a joint project to design a heavy infantry tank. The British were already working on updating their own Churchill tanks, which are beasts, while the Americans were putting the finishing touches on the M6 heavy tank. However, it's already good to have a backup. Always good to have a backup. And 2 heads are better than 1, right? So the engineering resources were pooled, and it was decided that the T-14 prototypes would be housed in the US, and work began in earnest. So in the meantime, the Second World War and recent operational experiences prompted the military to do a top-down review of their requirements for armored vehicles. When 2 prototypes were built and tested in 1943, it quickly became apparent that the tank design fell short of meeting the Army's needs, so we're going to put it in War Thunder. Both the British and Americans succeeded in solving this problem by tweaking their own heavy tanks and were wholly satisfied with the results. The T-14's advantages weren't enough to warrant interrupting production and modernizing programs already underway, so we're putting it into War Thunder. Military leaders refused to rethink the concept so close to their important clash with Hitler's forces in Europe. That racist bastard. The T-14 never saw any real action, but we're about to see how it fares on the battlefields of War Thunder. The T-14, not to be confused with the T-14 Armata, closely resembles the Sherman. Yep. It has a cast turret and a sharply angled front armor plate, as well as the 75mm M3 cannon favored by players. Favored by players? Favored by players? Favored by players? Well, maybe with the recent BR changes, which, by the way, Gaijin, little round of applause. If you can't tell what that is, that's some clapping. I think that was great. It is great. I feel like a lot of us are very happy. Obviously, there's always things that need to be changed, but that was a considerable effort to address some serious issues and some serious concerns by the community. And I'm very happy by it. And you know, that was one of the things, is I look forward to playing the Shermans more often than I otherwise would have as a result of those BR changes. But you know, this thing It's going to have the Shermans. What's interesting is in the design and development, I'm not sure if either of the prototypes had it, but at one point they were considering the British QF 6-pounder, which is a 57mm gun. So my thought was like, why not put that on it? Because then it's at least, I don't know. See, is this practical or not? Would it be better or not? You could always adjust the BR, right? This thing could be sort of almost like Matilda-esque, but like for the Americans. I was thinking that it would be good for the Americans if it had a British 57mm. It would make it interesting. It would make it distinctive from the other Shermans. It would have a little bit better armor, you know, but maybe the gun would have better penetration but less explosive capabilities. You know, you'd have to compare the QF 6-pounder to the American M3 75mm. But I don't know. That was a thought I had. Anyway, so the powertrain is similar to that of a Sherman at 500 horsepower. So despite it being conceived as an assault tank and a heavy tank, at the end of testing it turned out the T-14's armor wouldn't be sufficient to push it up into the heavy tank class. So, you know, it was designed as a heavy tank, but by the time it came out in, what, 1943, 1944, it was like, oh, this isn't a heavy tank. You know, this isn't a heavy tank. The hull armor is only 50 millimeters thick all around, and the front is composed of 2 armor plates angled at around 60 degrees, which give it an effective thickness of northwards of 100 millimeters. So that's pretty good. The transmission is protected by 101 millimeters of plating, and the turret armor is comparable to the Sherman. So 102 millimeters on the sides of the cast turret, making it hard to penetrate, while the typically rounded shape guarantees frequent ricochets. The T-14 boasts 50 caliber machine guns on the top, as well as 12.7 millimeters of steel armored plates on the tracks, kind of as like what the Germans would call Schürzen, you know, what you could call spaced armor, which handily protects them against shockwaves from bombs and rocket shells. Seeing as how bombing needs to seriously be addressed in War Thunder, you know, I'm glad you brought that up, guys. I'm glad you said that it protects against the shockwaves from bombs and rocket shells. Anyway, while heat shells that strike the plates will arm and detonate outside the tank, doing no damage, but I gotta be curious. Like, I'm assuming this is gonna be anywhere between 3.7 and 4.3. Who really uses heat shells at that BR? You know what I mean? So it's like, well, why are you talking about heat shells when, let's be honest, you know, you're not going to be encountering those things, I don't really think. So anyway, the no-nonsense T-14 will be a Rank 2 premium vehicle. Yeah, who's using heat rounds at the second tier? Anyway, will be a Rank 2 premium vehicle in the US tech tree, joining the earlier Shermans in battle as an excellent addition to your deck in arcade battles, and a trump card against enemy airdrop bombs in realistic battles. Don't miss the T-14 in the next major update in War Thunder, a truly excellent tank. Now, I'm gonna go ahead and say this. I think this tank is pretty interesting. It's kind of a piece of history. I myself am a tank collector, so I'm gonna get it. But it's just kind of funny that they said, oh, don't worry, you'll be able to protect yourself against bombs dropped in realistic battles. But like, how many people are really like, I think like there's a lot more, well, you know, there is, but I guess when I think of bombing in realistic battles, I think how like medium bombers and heavy bombers are more or less, you know, useless, and it's all about like dive bombing now. But what I do like is how that kind of has forced an emphasis on the ballistics-based ground attack weapons. You know, the Panzerknackers and the 50 calibers of freedom at the lower tiers. Granted, that's much less skill dependent than firing a 37, you know, from a Panzerknacker diving down at like a very steep angle. But it has made dive bombing and ballistics-based ground attacking a lot more prevalent in realistic battles, which I think is fun because that is a skill for sure. But it would be nice to see bombers addressed in the future. But, you know, I think that's definitely an area that needs to be addressed. But the T-14 looks kind of cool. Like I said earlier, it's like a Sherman and a Panther, you know, the byproduct of a late night between those two tanks. So yeah, we've seen the Spey Panzer, the RU-251 and the T-14, both of which are premiums. So And here's the other question. Are they going to drop ships in 1.67? Or are they going to think we probably, like, this needs some work still? Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, the American T-14, quote, intended to be a heavy infantry support tank, but is actually not. So there's that. Anyway, guys, thanks for watching. See you guys in the next video.